Cliff, so much for organizing this. It's always a great pleasure for me to be here in San Miguel de Allende and with this community in particular, whose level of interest and support for our work and our program has always been very high. It's a pleasure to be in this beautiful space. You know, I'm sorry that we didn't have more room. It's always sad to turn people away, but I'm so glad to see all of you here and familiar faces as well. Well, as Cliff mentioned, you know, there's so much to talk about, and I want to go over things fairly quickly, because I'm really interested in having that question period and knowing what most interests you, so that we can have more of a dialogue at the end. You know, when the elections took place on July 1st, 2018, there were people, after Manuel Lopez Obrador won by a landslide, there were those who believed that the world was coming to an end, and those that believed that we'd be on the doorstep to paradise, basically. So after a little more than a year, we have to take a logical, you know, and realistic assessment of where we're at. And of course, as is usually the case, we're someplace between heaven and hell. After a year, the results have been mixed at best. The president emphasizes that many promises have been kept, and that this is a work in the making, that dismantling 71 years of authoritarian rule and even more of a neoliberal economic model and a political model that was really built on corruption is a long-term project, and that they need more time. But let's take a look at what's really happened. First of all, in the area of economy, on March 17th, and this was basically a repetition of what he'd said many times before, President Lopez Obrador announced that neoliberalism had ended. What do we mean by neoliberalism, really quickly? We mean by the shift that took place in Mexico from an economy with a high degree of state involvement to an open capitalist economy in which exports played a much bigger role, the state played a much lesser role, and international investment became to be considered the motor of the economy. The real centerpiece of this shift in the economic model was the North American Free Trade Agreement that went into effect on January 1st, 1994. As many will immediately relate, the same day that the Zapatista uprising took place in Chiapas, proposing a completely different direction for the country. After many years of NAFTA, what became clear, and this was one of the big reasons that Lopez Obrador won the elections on July 1st, was that this economic model had created a high degree of inequality. There were still some 53 million people, poor people, in the country, a larger number than at the beginning of NAFTA, in complete contradiction to the promises that all boats would rise, basically, under this open capitalist free trade economy. There were also a handful of multi-billionaires that made the Forbes list of international wealthiest people in the world every year. So this degree of inequality had become a major source of discontent among not just the poor, but among the middle class, which had actually shrunk during this time. And that became the base of the Lopez Obrador campaign, which began in his first campaign with the slogan, "First the Poor," very directly oriented toward people who had been excluded from both the economy and from political power historically in Mexico. And then later with a milder, somewhat milder and less class-focused message in order to create a broader base that enabled him to win the elections in 2018. Whether or not neoliberalism has actually ended is certainly open to discussion. It's not something that can be done by decree, and it's not something even by a president who now has control of the Congress as well because of the victory of his Morena party. And it's not something that can be done overnight. The idea is that the government will play a more active role in redistribution of wealth and creating more equality within the country, and that's begun mainly through social programs. 11 million grants have been given out to students, or just young people who want to study. There's a new program of building universities throughout the country that provide access to education for a part of the population that didn't have access to education before. There have been grants that are given to single mothers, grants to elderly people, universal pensions, grants to the smallest really of small farmers, campesinos who had also had very little access to support or to credit in the past. And in total, and there's also grants that have been given out to provide first jobs for young people who want to work and have had a lot of problems getting into the workforce in the past. It remains to be seen, what the long-term effect of this policy will be. Some of the grants are just to get started, and so we have to see, for example, if employers provide the jobs to keep those young people employed and the training that they need to take on career paths. But so far, it has made a difference in communities where, especially poor communities, where people are receiving that influx of state money that they didn't receive before. One of the points that has been most criticized and was the biggest disappointment to the government itself is in the area of growth. The growth, now the official figures just came out recently. Well, these are the World Bank and the IMF figures, because the Mexican government ones have not come out for 2019, and growth was 0. That's bad. It's bad for their programs, it's bad for the people. It also has to be taken into account that there were global factors at play. Overall growth for Latin America was only around, they're anticipating 0.7%. So there's a number of external factors there, and there are a number of kind of red flags within the government. One of the big aspects that's been emphasized by the Lopez Obrador government, it has to do with this kind of ethos of governing. And the morality of this particular president is the austerity program. We're not talking about like an IMF austerity program, which means cutting back on state services. Obviously, there's belief that the state has to play an active role, but we're talking about, from their perspective, cutting back on waste, looking to see where the corruption was draining off public resources. But in some ways, the focus was so extreme that there was a constriction in even budgets for the different ministries were underspent at times and that constrains an economy as well. So they're trying to loosen up a little, at least the money that's already assigned, and that they know where it's going to go. And they're hoping that there will be, or they're predicting that there will be growth in this year 2020. And the international financing banks are also predicting that there will be growth, but it's fairly limited. This is the case, again, with the rest of the continent as well. The inflation, which you might not expect to be an area of success, actually has been. And I say you might not expect that because traditionally, when you're giving out the grants and you have more state money going to people to promote consumption and to promote more active role in the economy, and you have the kinds of increases in minimum wage and in median wage that we've seen under this government, you can anticipate sometimes inflation. Inflation is always a focus, controlling inflation, of neoliberal governments, and not so much a focus of governments that are really putting a lot more effort into trying to create a more equal economy. And yet, we've seen one of the lowest rates of inflation in recent years, which also has benefits for workers and the populations that the government is trying to benefit, because things don't cost more than they would have before. Investment, again, where you might have anticipated problems because of the uncertainty, particularly of capitalists who are now looking at a center-left government that's explicitly criticizing a neoliberal capitalist model, has held steady. And the latest figures show that there was actually a very good level of investment in Mexico during a period when there was, admittedly, quite a bit of uncertainty. Which goes to show, too, that there's interest in Mexico and that there's certain inertias in terms of even what may appear to be radical political changes. And the president says, we're radical. You know, he uses the word, he talks about radical being going to the roots, but particularly in terms of changing the political system, and especially in terms of eliminating corruption. And even in this context, with the NAFTA going back and forth, the renegotiation of NAFTA going back and forth, we've seen a good level of investment. In the area of corruption, which has been one of the most important areas for the government, they've announced that they've issued some 70 million pesos worth of fines. There's been a major program against huachicoleo, which people here should know because it's kind of a center of huachicoleo, which is fuel theft, where they either tap organized crime or sometimes even local communities and smaller entities, you know, tap into fuel lines of Pemex or fuel trucks or hijack fuel trucks in order to steal fuel and sell them oftentimes to legitimate businesses, gas stations that then buy it cheaper. In fact, it's even been discovered that refineries in the United States were buying stolen fuel at some point. And somewhat surprisingly, there was a big crackdown on this. Close to the beginning of the Lopez Obrador government, there were a few days there when there were massive fuel scarcities, gasoline scarcities throughout the country that caused criticisms. But they changed the entire distribution system, and the claim is anyway that the huachicoleo has been brought under control, which means returning. There's different estimates, but literally billions of pesos to federal and public coffers that were previously lost to organized crime. The renegotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, which is now called the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, has been a very delicate process. As many will recall, President Trump announced that he would renegotiate NAFTA as part of campaign promises, declaring that NAFTA was the worst trade agreement ever. And the Mexican government had very little to do with it. The Peña Nieto government, the previous Peña Nieto government, entered into the talks essentially with an attitude of damage control. They had no really forward-looking agenda, despite the fact that Mexico had lost considerably in many sectors under the free trade agreement. The rhetoric of the renegotiation that came out of the Trump administration was essentially the United States has a significant trade deficit with Mexico. Ergo, Mexico is taking advantage of the United States, and we have to renegotiate this agreement. And the other major part of this was Mexico pays its workers far less than the United States, and corporations are taking jobs, are stealing jobs, from the United States factories to relocate to Mexico. Now, in the first, the problem from the perspective of economic analysis is that a trade deficit is a very small part, and many would argue somewhat insignificant part, of an overall highly integrated bilateral relationship, an economic relationship, and in no way does it reflect that one country is taking advantage of another country, and especially in the case of Mexico and the United States, because the form of integration is not just we sell to you, you sell to us, we have a commerce and there's investment involved. It's more like this. So you have an automobile, which is not just it's the classic example, and it's also the bulk of what they were negotiating in this agreement, because it's so important in the relationship. And that automobile, to be built and then sold in the United States, oftentimes the calculation was that between one part and another, it's crossed the border some 20 times before it's finally sold. So you've got U.S. parts coming down to Mexico, being assembled here, going back and forth. to say that it's just a Mexican product that's being sold in the United States and creating a trade deficit is to ignore the nuances and the high degree of integration that exists within that relationship. Then the other point, that Mexico is stealing jobs from the United States, is also much more complicated. We began to get together with Mexican and Canadian organizations, workers' organizations and farm organizations particularly, at the beginning. Can you hear me better like here? Okay. At the beginning of around 1992, when they started the negotiations, and nobody really knew what a free trade agreement was. And there was almost no precedent for a free trade agreement between a developing country with a much smaller economy and the economic superpower of the world, the United States. And at that time, as the process evolved, and then after seeing the effects of the free trade agreement, what quickly became clear is that small family farmers from the United States and Mexico and Canada had much more in common with each other than they did between the family farmers and the corporate farmers in the United States. And the same was true with workers. Workers in the three countries had much more in common with each other than they did with the industry owners and leaders in their country. This, from a certain perspective, is to be expected, but what it means is that the framework of looking at these trade agreements of United States versus Mexico versus Canada and who wins is entirely skewed, when actually the us against them battles that are going on have to do with the people on the bottom and the people on the top. But this rhetoric of Donald Trump appealed to a large portion of the US working class, enough to win an election. And we saw that happen in the industrialized blue-collar states, for the most part, that was suffering not a problem of unemployment, which we've seen in the past. Actually, employment's very high, so in many ways, it's hard to understand this argument that Mexico was stealing jobs. But they were suffering a situation of estancamiento. It's like, you know, of no progress, yeah, of no wage gains among a certain sector. And basically, there's a kind of a sense that my children's future will not necessarily be better than my life was. And when you get to that point in a culture where you're looking at the way things are going, you're working hard and losing ground, there begins to be a broad level of discontent that searches for answers and searches for, in this case, a charismatic or strong figure that can break a mold that's been looking kind of desperate for a while. There's many explanations of what happened in that night, in that 2016 election, and why it happened, but the working class clearly played a major role. And at some point, the explanation that it was Mexico's fault and that Mexican workers were the enemy resonated. And it has been used, not just throughout the campaign, as all of you know, but also into the Trump administration, not only to fortify that working class base, saying now we're going to renegotiate NAFTA, now those Mexican workers aren't going to take advantage of us anymore, now we're going to have a more even playing field, and we'll get to that in a bit, but also on the issue of migration. You know, saying now that it was successfully posited that the other big enemy were immigrants, many of whom are Mexicans in the United States. They were the competition, the illegal competition. They are the other, according to this white supremacist view, and not just the other, but the dangerous other. This explains the emphasis on building the wall as a symbol of us versus them, on a constant attack on asylum rights, on refugees, on immigration, and on Mexicans and on Mexico in general. I've been here for over 30 years, and I've never seen an era of Mexico bashing in general, you know, as I have during this administration. I was covering the US elections in Washington, D.C. when Trump was elected, and I know many people were shocked. We could see it coming, if not immediately or surely. We knew it was a possibility before that. And really, in many ways, my heart had been broken before the elections. Because before the elections, we could see that it was close enough that we knew that somewhere around 40% of the US public had bought this idea, which formed a centerpiece of the campaign, that Mexico and Mexicans were the enemy. And I imagine that there are many people in this room who felt that way and who felt the disappointment and the despair when this happened, and as this continues to happen, because we love both countries. No? And we know who the Mexican people are, and we know that they're not thieves and racists. And the idea that, and the people that we know and live with in the United States as well, could actually believe that is heartbreaking. So this happens, and it continues to happen, and we're now seeing that there's a very real possibility of a re-election along the same lines. There was a time when, just a month or so ago, when I was seriously concerned that Mexico would be used as the diversionary war in the new campaign. Trump had already threatened to send in the army after the Le Baron massacres, that we'll talk about in just a second. And the rhetoric was ratcheting up in terms of the hostility toward Mexico and its inability to control its crime situation, in particular as a national security threat. As we all know, they then presented Iran as the diversionary war on the horizon. So we haven't heard quite as much about it, but I'm convinced that Mexico will again be used, and immigration in particular, be used as a campaign mobilizer for that part of the population as we move closer to the 2020 elections. What happened with the NAFTA negotiation then is supposedly today is the day that they're going to take NAFTA finally to the renegotiated agreement to the Senate. As people know, the first negotiation that was signed between the three countries before ratification in Congress created a number of changes, some of which actually benefit Mexico. As I said, the Mexican government's perspective in this was to do damage control. They didn't really seek demands. They basically just tried to block what they felt was going to be harmful for the country. But in particular, we have the elimination of the state corporate tribunals, which is a supranational courts that would try cases in which corporations were allowed to sue the Mexican government or any government for not only loss of earnings, but loss of future earnings. Just to give you an idea what this meant, they were pro-corporate tribunals. There was a case early on that we worked on called Metalclad, where a toxic waste plant from the United States they were investing in creating a toxic waste dump in a little town in San Luis Potosí. They didn't have a local permit. But then the government, there was a strong local opposition to this because of the environmental damage that it would cause, which would be extensive and was not adequately controlled. And so finally the state government declared it, and it was a highly sensitive ecological zone in the state of San Luis Potosí. So the state government finally stopped the project and declared it a protected area. Well, the corporation came back and sued for millions of dollars, not just in what they'd invested, which was minimal at that time, but in what they anticipated earning. Forget the risk factor of capitalism here, they've really taken that out. And they won in one of these corporate tribunals, and the Mexican government had to pay for protecting its land and its people. And that wasn't the only case. There's a number, and they don't just have to do with Mexico. So it was a victory to get rid of those courts, those tribunals. Another was that there was a lot of emphasis, and this is why it was held up so long, on corporations not being able to use cheaper labor force and the lack of labor law of enforcement here in Mexico to produce more cheaply, that it was undercutting U.S. workers. And so the labor side agreements and the environmental side agreement as well of the original NAFTA are now brought into the agreement itself. And this is not the first time this happened. This has been in advance. It had happened before. And there's a new annex that has to do with Mexico require new labor legislation, which it already had, and the enforcement of labor legislation. And the main points are that within Mexico, in factories, there's what's called a protection contract. What that means is that workers sometimes start to organize, and they make like $4 a day. And so they start to organize, and they present a request to form a union in their workplace, and they come back and they say, this you can't because this workplace already has a union. And it turns out that the corrupt ruling party for 71 years, had created they had created a union. The workers didn't even know about it, much less sign on to it. They sign an agreement with the employer, and what it essentially does is block the formation of an independent union and real collective bargaining rights. There's thousands of those. The government now has to review hundreds of thousands of contracts throughout the country. But under labor legislation and now under the new USMCA, it's required to do that, and so they're working on it now. They also had a number of things that had to do with bringing wages up in the auto industry in particular, that had to do with rules of origin. They came to this agreement, and in the end, it was not a problem for the Mexican government because it was already planning to enforce labor reform and begin to kind of clean up the situation that existed with these corrupt unions. The Democrats also managed to strengthen the sanctions on labor violations and make a couple of other important modifications to the renegotiated NAFTA, one of which has to do with extensive monopoly rights, also known as patents, for pharmaceutical companies, in this case for biologic drugs, which in themselves are not all that common but are very important to some individuals and create the opportunity to, and we're just one of the most extreme cases of protections and of privileges for pharmaceutical companies, and the Democrats managed to eliminate that clause. So now it has been agreed on, the AFL-CIO agreed on it. Both parties are going to be spinning it as a victory for themselves. So we'll see a little battle going on around that. And Mexico is mostly just relieved. The reason is because this is not a good trade agreement. This agreement is essentially the same as the original NAFTA. There were no provisions made for the fact that the two economies are so disparate in their size and their strength. Like, say, when the European Union gets together, there was a fund for Spain and for Greece to bring them up to speed, and so that they could have a level field as they began to integrate the economies in Europe. There was never that in NAFTA, despite the fact that the differences were so much greater, and there's still nothing like that. But even more importantly, now 24, 25 years later, there isn't a single mention of climate change. There isn't a single mention of labor mobility, that is, immigration. There's no way you can ever talk about economic integration without talking about labor mobility. But it's not convenient because making workers illegal is convenient for powerful interests in the United States in particular, and so Mexico didn't even try to bring it to the table. There's also Canadian proposals to include a whole chapter on gender equality, because NAFTA had a particular hard impact on women. Many remained at home as small farmers when their husbands and other men were forced off of the farm and to migrate to the United States or to the cities. There's a number of ways in which this system had a detrimental effect on women and women's rights. That was thrown out off the table at the very beginning, and so was a proposed chapter on indigenous rights and respecting their international rights to control over natural resources and decisions being made in the territories where they're recognized. So when anyone says it's a model agreement, it definitely isn't. But for Mexico, the most important part of this is that it's over. It's like, and maybe today it will finally really be over, if the vote's taken. And the reason it's so important is a lesson in that asymmetrical relationship we've been talking about. What's happened with NAFTA is Donald Trump would wake up in the morning and tweet that he was sick of it and that negotiations weren't moving forward, so he's going to pull out. The peso drops. The investor ratings go down. The stock market goes down. The impact on Mexico is immediate, and even though it seems abstract because it's this international finance sphere that is abstract, where there's no accountability, the impact on people's lives is immediate here in Mexico. And the impact on a government that's attempting to remodel an economy and make some big changes and support massive social programs is also immediate. So it was a very volatile situation during the entire renegotiation, and this is why the Lopez Obrador government actually went along with, approved, and even heralded the pact that was essentially, like I said at the beginning, a very representative of precisely the type of economic model that he was supposedly trying to leave behind. It's not the same. We opposed NAFTA in 1992. It's not the same to oppose it today. We can't. Nobody came out virtually opposing a new NAFTA and saying, let's just drop it, because too many lives depended on that degree of integration. It can still be improved and should be improved at some point, but you can't turn back the clock on it, from one day to the next. And the government knew this and so supported those renegotiations. And in fact, Mexico ratified even before the United States, even with the uncertainty about whether the US Congress would eventually ratify or not. This kind of sword of Damocles that has been not just the US government, which, as we know, has announced from one day to the next 25% tariffs on Mexican exports, has announced closing the border, all as forms of economic blackmail to impose immigration policies, but also from the international finance community, or whatever you want to call it, has been very real and has had extremely negative effects on Mexican policies. Obviously, where we see this is in immigration. It's now the case that immigration is even more important than security and has actually been folded into that national security model in the US-Mexico bilateral relationship because of the focus of this particular US government on border control, on immigration, and on closing off the United States to migratory flows. So here's Mexico, which is now in the middle of the collapse of Central America, because that's what it is. It's not underdevelopment, it's a political crisis in all three countries known as the Northern Triangle. In El Salvador, the violence continues, particularly gang violence. In Honduras, there's a full-blown political crisis after a large part of the population rejected the re-election, the illegal, unconstitutional re-election of the president. and were met with repressive measures that have led to the assassination of many individuals among the political opposition. That crisis continues. And in Guatemala, they've had one corruption scandal after another under a series of governments that have been progressively accused of both corruption and violation of human rights. And in a context where international investment, again under this model, is displacing indigenous communities who are leading battles against mining projects and widespread monocropping within the country. So the immigration expulsion factors in these countries are not only not diminishing, they're actually increasing as nobody really deals with what the real causes are, and at the same time these people who have been forced out of their homes are criminalized and hunted down and imprisoned as they go up, not only through the United States but now through Mexico as well. Mexico deported a record number of Central Americans, and this was after an original policy that said we're going to accept them, give them humanitarian visas so they don't have to go through the country in the hands of organized crime, which is the other option. When you criminalize something, just as we know from Prohibition, what you do is you deliver a market to dangerous and brutal organized crime elements. And now they've delivered the entire market of unauthorized immigration, not only in the United States, but here in Mexico, to powerful organized crime groups. This has had a terrible effect on immigrants themselves. If there's a crisis, it's not that immigrants are going into our societies, which actually have the capacity to absorb these people, and the numbers are not nearly as large or unprecedented historically as they're often made out to be. But the crisis is for the immigrants themselves. You know, some 60% of women assume that they'll be raped after they leave Central America and come up through Mexico to go to the United States. They go to the drugstores in El Salvador and ask for the Mexico pill so that at least they won't get pregnant along the way. That's what it's called. You know, there's some, when they count the number of disappeared here in Mexico, nobody even bothers to count the immigrants, and nobody really knows, but the estimate is some 100,000 people who've disappeared traveling through Mexico to the United States. So the human cost has been tremendous, and is very rarely even considered in the policy debates, because the whole discourse has dehumanized the people who are on all sides of the equation, the victims of the current status quo. I want to move on to what is the other big failure, really, of the Lopez Obrador government so far, and that is security, or the lack thereof, here in Mexico. This past year, 2019, registered some 36,000 homicides, and that's a record since the numbers have been taken, and really kept properly, which began about 1980. That is not counting the number that was recently released of 61,000 people who are disappeared. Nobody really has an explanation for why this is happening or why the numbers were so high this year. You know, there's political explanations that say the government isn't doing its job. Obviously, the government is not successful. There's also, if you look at it, there's a trajectory. There has been rising violence since 2006, well, 2007 really, because the drug war was launched at the end of 2007. The violence since then has been rising precipitously. We do see a dip in about 2013 under the Peña Nieto government, 2014, and then we see it rise again. The Lopez Obrador government states that what they're dealing with is, you know, the momentum of this rise as they begin to try to turn it around, and that they need more time. There's a lot of credibility in some sense to this, but it doesn't justify the obvious fact that that they failed, this first year, not only to not reduce it, but that it increased. But the logic of it is that, in general, what this dynamic began with the US-Mexico war on drugs. Quickly, we've talked about this a number of times before. People who have been there know that it's something I've been working on for a long time now, since the war on drugs was launched. Because the minute it was launched, our analysis was, and of many other people as well, this is going to be terrible. This is going to be terrible because if you militarize a war on drugs by declaring the drug war, by declaring the cartels an enemy of a foreign enemy, instead of a health problem, something that rises out of society and themselves, and something that is also, again, the result of prohibition, You fight violence with violence and you get more violence. Just to put it in the simplest of terms. Essentially, the US imposes a model on Mexico which is called the Kingpin Strategy, that comes out of the DEA. The war on drugs was launched, invented really, by the Nixon administration. And it's more than a war on cartels, because we know that they're not weakened. We know that illicit flows don't stop or even diminish under this war on drugs model. What it is a mechanism of social control. It's also a new area of conflict that creates vast markets for defense companies, for intelligence services, and for Pentagon intervention. And that's exactly what's happened in Mexico. Illicit flows have not diminished after $3 billion of US investment. They go in, they take out a kingpin, say in Acapulco. Within days, there's an explosion of violence in Acapulco, because either another cartel sees that this one's been weakened and comes in and launches a turf war to see who takes over this territory, or there's a war of succession within the cartel where the leader was taken out, or the cartel fragments into smaller groups that compete with each other and that actually prey upon the community itself in a far more brutal way than they do, than the larger cartel that was essentially just trying to carry out its business, right? So this what's happened. It's been tragic to see it, this explosion of violence that's taken place within the country. And the government announced that it was ending the drug war. The government also announced that it was ending the Merida Initiative, which is the major vehicle, in fact, I was just in the embassy yesterday, and they said, well, all US aid to Mexico essentially goes through the Merida Initiative. The Merida Initiative is a regional cooperation, security cooperation initiative. There's very little economic aid that goes to Mexico. Almost all of it is focused on this disastrous security model. So I asked them, well, look at the results. Are you planning to reconsider? And I've asked them a couple times, and they always say no. And this, as we began to analyze this, at first, we're reluctant to say this war is going on because there are interests behind it that are not stated in the objectives, because it sounds like a conspiracy theory, kind of. But there came a point when you see these governments replicating not only failed policies, but policies that were massively murdering the citizenry, and you have to wonder, why on earth would they do that if there wasn't something else going on, And then it becomes pretty clear what is going on. And the U.S. Embassy was pretty open about it, in a sense. They were going, this is the way that we engage with the Mexican government. It's true that this government announced they were ending it, but they're not. They just said, well, how this was the answer to it. Well, how presidents say things so that they can act like they're really making changes. It was so disrespectful in terms of any concept of national sovereignty. They said, no, we're going ahead, we're with the same policy, and we're happy to say that, we haven't faced any real obstacles so far. And there was no sense of self-criticism. Then the last time, about a year ago, this was over a year ago, And they said, well, we're focusing instead of on the federal government, we're focusing on parts of the country where we have a high degree of cooperation with the state governments and can carry out a deeper policy, they didn't say intervention, but of engagement in security area. And I said, well, where is that? And they said, Guanajuato. And I said, are you aware that Guanajuato is now, since you started this program, little Guanajuato, which was like one of the safest places in the country, is now the most violent state in the country. There was, last month it came in with 20% of homicides. I don't mean to scare you, because obviously we know where we're safe and where we're not. But I mean, so again, you have this, where there's more intervention with this model, there's more violence. Where there's more armed forces occupation, checkpoints, there's more violence. And there's more criminal activity as well. The degree of corruption is also extremely high. And the Lopez Obrador government has launched the National Guard. You've probably seen them around. They have new uniforms. They're kind of like desert camouflage, white, And, but other than that, they're not much different they're certainly not much different from the armed forces. They're led by the armed forces. Their federal commander is a member of the armed forces. It was supposed to be a civilian force, and it's supposed to gradually become more of a civilian force, but it's replicating that same model of intervention. And now they've been deployed, 27,000 in immigration contention. So we have this major shift in Mexico of seeing immigrants not as people who are fleeing violence and are fleeing hunger, but as a force to be contained, which is 100% attributable to the pressures from the United States government. This relationship from the United States, as I mentioned, has gone back and forth with the threats, the threat of the tariffs, the threat of closing the border, and what the government has responded with is a surprisingly cordial response. They have spoken highly of the Trump administration. They have avoided confrontation at every turn, including adopting programs that have been very harmful to human rights and to human beings, one of which is the Remain in Mexico program, sending asylum seekers in the United States back over the border to Mexico. We did a series of videos for the Real News on that, with interviews from asylum seekers. They have nowhere to go. They're in Tijuana, living in the streets. Their families are vulnerable. They're vulnerable to organized crime. There's no support for these people. They just want to disappear them, essentially. And some are waiting more than a year for their asylum hearings in the United States. And the Mexican government accepted this program formally from the United States, although it was presented as a unilateral rule change in the United States. They've also funded the militarization of the southern border, and they're looking at a new program of aid that would provide funding to Central American countries and to southern Mexico, with the idea that there would be people would be able to find jobs in those countries and no longer migrate. But again, the premise of this, that development, some linear form of development in which these countries are behind, is the problem, completely overlooks the political crises that are taking place and that are actually supported by government policies and foreign aid policies, and completely overlooks other factors such as climate change. Many of the projects they're talking about funding in Central America and southern Mexico are projects that have detrimental environmental impacts and social impacts. This is one of the areas that's kind of a red flag within the Lopez Obrador government. In fact, the Zapatista Army for National Liberation has already come out specifically against and announced it will be organizing indigenous communities in the South against some of the major mega projects, which are the Tren Maya, the train that will go across the Lacandon jungle and other parts of southern Mexico, and the isthmus, the development of the isthmus of Tehuantepec. There's the Sembrando Vida is another big one, which is the planting of fruit trees in the area. And their communities are divided, you know, it's not all of one opinion or another, but there has been a fairly serious lack of communication and adequate consultation mechanisms that are actually guaranteed indigenous peoples under international law, that is going to cause increased social discontent and possibly conflict in the future with these mega projects. The focus in just finally then, the Mexican role on the international stage, we've talked about the United States and how they're playing it cool. You know, they're either holding their breath, hoping that something different will happen in the elections, or for now thinking, well, let us get a little further on with our program before we risk any type of a confrontation. In any case, it's been a little disturbing to large parts of the Mexican population because, as I'm sure you're aware, if there's anything that Mexicans agree on, and we're in a particularly polarized political moment right now, it's disapproval of Donald Trump and his government. So they see these like, oh yes, he's doing a wonderful job, you know, these like over-the-top praise letters coming out of their president who was elected in part because he was considered to be a president who would stand up to the U.S. government, you know, and there's considerable amount of disappointment there, but there's also a sense that perhaps, I mean, I think that it has to change sometime. It can't continue like this. You know, there will be some kind of a rupture sometime when Mexico has to stand up for values that are very different than what's coming out of Washington currently. In the regional area, the government has avoided taking a leading role, and it's beginning to move away from that. Lopez Obrador hasn't gone to the United Nations. He sends Marcelo Obrador, the Secretary of State. He hasn't taken a leading role. He has said, I'm dedicating myself to the changes that we have to make on the domestic front. Now, just recently, the community of Latin American countries met in Mexico, and they did, in fact, take a stronger role of saying it's time to build some South-South alliances, which traditionally, when there were more center-left governments in Latin America, have been the means to confront U.S. hegemony, historical hegemony in the region, and to create some trade relationships that are a little bit more horizontal. They kind of fell to the wayside when the governments when right-wing governments were elected. Now, with the return of the left in Argentina and Mexico playing a more prominent role, those are beginning to be revived. Mexico is also important in objecting to the regime change plans for Venezuela, refusing to join a group of Latin American countries that were pressing for the forced removal of Nicolás Maduro and saying that this has to be negotiated, not through military solutions. And it was important in receiving Evo Morales after the coup d'etat in Bolivia. So we'll probably be seeing a little more proactive role of Mexico in the future on some of those areas. Well, I want to wrap up. There's always more to say, but I'm very interested, as I mentioned, in hearing what you're interested in, what you want to talk about, and say that for us, we have a particular role. And when I say us, I mean those of us who have a deep love and deep ties to both countries, to the United States and to Mexico. Within our program, one of our kind of mottos is that as analysts, political analysts, to understand you have to show up. And that means not just analyzing the issues, but then on the basis of an informed opinion, taking a stand, to show up, to stand up, and to speak up. And I know that many of you in this role are doing that now. It doesn't matter on what level or how you do it, but you're involved in projects with the communities here around San Miguel de Allende. You're involved just by being here today, you know, in looking at the issues that affect us as binational, if not citizens, as binational human beings in many ways, and you're involved in wanting to know more and wanting to do more. That's going to be so important for the relationship going into the future, no matter who's president where. It's those people-to-people relationships that are really at the basis of it. The threats we're facing now, and again, this is after decades of analyzing the U.S.-Mexico relationship, the threats we're facing now are very grave. And there are many human lives that are in the balance as we look at it. But to show up, you know, I think in the end it doesn't even really feel like an obligation. It feels like an opportunity. And it's a unique opportunity that we have because of those ties and the understanding and the relationship with the people on both sides of the border. It's that human connection to, you know, in this case, on both sides of the border that we found through all the analysis, through all the information, you know, through all the competing opinions, is really the basis for building peace. So I want to thank you all, not just for being here, but for being everywhere else you are, as you care about what's going on, as you care about the people who are affected. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Laura, for a rich presentation. And speaking of riches, her America's project depends upon a lot of donations to sustain it financially. And so I'm going to pass a hat around and ask you to share some wealth, make a donation, if you will, to support the America's project.
And we can take checks just made out to CIP America's program. We don't have any government funding, so we really depend on readers. Again, you can find our work on americas.org to continue doing what we're doing. And I think that this is a really critical moment to do that.
Now for the question period, I will ask Peter to take the mic around because you have easier movement around. But make your questions brief so that we can get comment in from as many of you as possible.
In the negotiations of NAFTA, one of the things that the Americans wanted was to be able to organize teams that would be able to go into various manufacturing industries and see that they're raising rates. And they claimed that that was part of the deal. And the Mexicans fell off their chairs when they heard that. Do you know what that is right now?
Yeah, that inspection, I mean, they kind of fudged it in the end because the Mexicans were unwilling to, as a violation of national sovereignty, to have U.S. officials going into their factories, or at one point also said, okay, you want Mexican officials going into your factories, you know, and which of course the United States objected to. In the end, what they did is that they're beefing up a labor component within the Mexican embassy, and as I understand it, they don't actually have like on-site privileges autonomously, but they will be able to verify some aspects of enforcement alongside the Mexican government officials responsible for enforcement.
Can you enlighten me a little bit?
Oh, he's got the
Wait for the mic to come.
Can you enlighten me a little bit about Canada and all this? Can you one more time? Close to your mouth. Can you enlighten me a bit about Canada in the NAFTA and all of this that you've been talking about? What are we doing?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, some of the more visionary proposals actually came out of the Canadian government, which now officially has a feminist foreign policy, one of the few countries in the world. And they were thrown out immediately. And other than that, the Canadian government didn't take a very strong position in terms of defense of those policies. In fact, it sold out a number of its own grassroots sectors. One of the major ones is the dairy farmers that had a very efficient and effective supply control system in place. within Canada that was attacked by the new USMCA. The Canadians are protesting that the end result is a death by 1,000 cuts. And then they got into this period in the negotiations where Donald Trump was threatening to break it down into bilateral agreements. And Canada actually agreed at one point, according to the scuttlebutt. And then there was another point in which it looked like they were going to enter into a negotiating agreement with Mexico. But so the upshot is that, from my perspective anyway, there was a notable lack of solidarity between Canada and Mexico in trying to negotiate anything that would be beneficial to the two countries vis-a-vis, the tremendous negotiating power of the United States.
Let me pose a question about energy policy in the Obrador administration. One of the provisions in the old NAFTA that I understand has been continued, although the investor-state dispute settlement provisions have been removed, except in the energy sector. And it appears that those plans involve a very heavy reliance on increasing and promoting petroleum. Is there any effort that you know of to try to diversify and develop alternative energy like solar?
Yeah, that's absolutely true that when they got rid of those corporate state panels, they did make an exception precisely for Mexican oil. So if, for example, a transnational oil company believes that it's not making enough money because of some type of regulation by the Mexican state, they can sue them. And it's the only exception really to the elimination of that clause. The Lopez Obrador government has followed what has, and I think unfortunately, been a strategy of center-left governments within Latin America, which is to, in at least a first phase, take over, regain control of natural resource use to benefit the public, is the way the strategy is framed. And so what it means is a greater national participation, like with, in this case, strengthening Pemex, the Parastate Petroleum Institute, or business actually. There's a big focus on building the refinery in Veracruz despite environmental complaints regarding the plans, with the idea that we are currently, exporting our oil to the United States and being forced to re-import it. Obviously, there's a certain logic to this, with Mexico not gaining the rent from value added of the oil that's being refined in the United States. But the problem, as Cliff alluded to, is that there seems to be no recognition whatsoever that every society on Earth must be moving toward fossil-free, societies, and the reduction as rapidly as possible of reliance on the use of fossil fuels. There are some programs for investment in renewable energies. There's also some conflicts that are being caused by those because they're essentially taking place with the same kind of corporate model that's caused, for example, conflicts with the wind energy projects in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec and indigenous communities. But again, there's very little investment. It's proportionally minimal compared to what's being put into petroleum, into oil products. One of the things that came out as the grand achievement with the first year report was that for the first time they turned around the tendency of reduced production within Pemex, and that production had actually gone up. And again, right at a time where keeping oil in the soil is a necessary part of planetary survival. The one good thing, and it's still kind of up in the air because there have been some steps backwards, is the prohibition of fracking within the country. There's also, in terms of natural resources, a moratorium on new mining concessions. But the protest is that most of the country has already been granted in concessions. So what they really need to do is start reviewing and seeing where corruption took place in those and actually getting rid of some of them. Because if they were developed, all the mining concessions, we would probably have no reliable water supply left. Again, an issue that here in Guanajuato people are probably very familiar with.
You mentioned three things. One was a train that you want to build. An isthmus, you mentioned an isthmus. I wasn't familiar with that at all. Could you enlarge on that?
That's a series of mega projects like the wind energy, and I don't know all the projects that are involved, but it's a development. The idea is that one of the things that they noticed quite soon after NAFTA was that there was a disparate rate of development and investment and resources in general between the north and the south of the country. And that while a lot of investment came down into the northern part that had greater proximity to the United States, less indigenous populations, the southern part was actually becoming poorer at the same time. So his concept is to even that up, but using the same types of projects that have been used and actually caused displacement rather than community development within those areas, which is the protest of the indigenous communities. And like I say, I'd have to get back to you on what the precise projects besides wind energy, electrical grids being created within that region, and communication in terms of highway construction in particular are within the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, but it's generally along this model of greater neoliberal integration.
I'm a journalist and I cover the food business for a publisher in DC, so I kind of watched this business with the tariffs pretty closely. And I actually thought the AMLO government handled that negotiation really well. Not that it was really a negotiation, because Trump appeared to be putting Mexico over a barrel, with these threats, and also got them to keep the immigrants in Mexico and so forth. But he did dispatch members of his cabinet to DC where they were tweeting wildly. They were kind of taking a page from Trump's, playbook as well. And it wouldn't have helped the United States, businesses on the other side of the border to have those tariffs there. And also private companies, you may know, were telling the American public, well, you'll be out of tomatoes in 3 weeks, people. And so it was sort of an educational process for us. But my question really for you is how you see the relationship with the press, both nationally and internationally, with AMLO. I mean, there he is every day doing these press conferences first thing in the morning, whereas Trump, we might get 2 minutes on the way to the helicopter,
Some tweets.
But I also see more negative coverage of AMLO, like from the New York Times and others. They jump on everything, Kulikan, Yeah, I mean, you just can't win. So I'm just wondering kind of how you see the evolving coverage and treatment of him and his administration today.
Okay, first I just want to, on the first point, when the negotiation first came out, I think I also at first thought that they dodged a bullet, basically. There was an immediate response and everything, but then we got the MPP. Then we got the Remain in Mexico program. At first, they didn't announce that. Remember, Trump was waiving his secret agreement, and because it looked like they hadn't really gotten too much out of the tariff threat when he announced he was suspending it. But then he said, oh, but I got this. And nobody knew what it was until they got it like a close-up shot, and then the government and the Mexican government admitted that they'd signed on to this. They said, oh, we're not going to be a third safe country, which is when you formally agree to take anyone, that migrants that are coming through your country have to stay there, basically, they're asylum seekers. But they did get that, so it was disappointing in the migration front. As far as the relationship with the press, it's interesting because there have been, I think the number was like 15 journalists assassinated in Mexico. They have not been able to turn that around. And they have, in some ways, the criticism, and I would have to agree, has been that they've exacerbated the problem because of an attitude. He opens up to the press at the press conferences, but has made frequent statements ridiculing critical press that puts all journalists in a position of greater vulnerability. The press in Mexico is highly polarized. It's where you really see, press and social media is where you really see the divisions that exist within the society and the offensive that's very organized on the part of very powerful interests against this Lopez Obrador government that would like to bring it down as soon as possible. And so the press has, plays a big role in articulating the opposition. The press that's owned by those interests, in articulating the opposition to Lopez Obrador government. And the Washington Post and Wall Street Journal and other major corporate media in the United States has also had, they came out formally against his candidacy, even when everybody knew he was going to win, and has also been, generally speaking, antagonistic. There's really nothing he can do about that. And one of the interesting things about the Mañanera, which is those morning press conferences, is it's a new degree of transparency and exposure to the press that, generally speaking, should be lauded, and the press itself should be appreciative of. But he's not talking to the press. He's coming out there every morning with the press in front of him asking questions. But he's talking to his base directly. That's the colloquialism that he uses. That's what to many appeared to be a kind of a lack of sophistication. And it seems to be working. Between that and the weekend visits to villages all over the country, we're still talking about a 70% approval rating. So he's using those press conferences also, to have a direct conduit to the people that support him.
A Chinese auto manufacturer recently announced a $600 million investment in Mexico in a new plant. Is Mexico looking at China as a bit of a counterbalance against U.S. influence?
Yeah, I think that's another important thing that I didn't mention is that to avoid this kind of economic blackmail that we've seen under the Trump administration, their longer-term plan is to both diversify investment and to jumpstart the internal market, which had been, to export less, actually, and produce more for the country itself, which had been reduced considerably under NAFTA. And, of course, in diversification, the Chinese are going to be very important. Basically, at a time when Latin America began to have much greater ties to Chinese investment. And I should add that they've had the same kinds of conflict with local communities and exploitation and pollution in many ways that they've had with U.S. investment. But at a time when other countries were able to enter into that relationship, Mexico missed the boat, because they were so focused on the United States and the relationship with the United States. So now, with these kinds of investments, they're basically playing catch-up in the world in terms of attracting and establishing the conditions for that Chinese investment, but it will be and has to be an important part of the diversification.
I have three things that I want to ask, if I may. I'll try to make them brief. Drucker did a Mr. Business evaluation in the early 70s about solving Mexico's big problem in those days, and he came up with a miraculous suggestion of transferring the water from the south to the north as a major solution. I'd like your opinion on that. Second, the auto industry here in Mexico being forced to increase the labor costs more coordinated with the the labor costs of the American unions. And then finally, Pemex not being selected to do a lot of the kinds of things that, that their industry has done in the past by the international oil companies. They don't want to work with Pemex on those things. They want other oil service companies to do that.
Well, did you mean water from southern Mexico to northern Mexico?
That was his suggestion. Yeah, he was given a sizable amount of money in the early 70s to offer a solution to Mexico's problem. And everyone thought, cut down on the population in those days. You know, in those days, the population was going up and at a tremendously fast rate. And he came up with, and that was what his team came up with, and said that would be the biggest benefit to Mexico, would be to move the water from the south to the north and improve the agricultural.
Yeah. But yeah, I can't really answer that question because I don't know. It's clear that the north is arid and the south has more water, but as far as I know, there's no major project to pipe water up, and I think that it'd be very difficult personally. But then on the auto part, so basically what the rule says is that 40 to 45% of production has to take place in plants that pay $16 or more. This is currently approximately 4 times what Mexican auto plants pay. It's a difficult formula in some ways to apply. It kind of sounds straightforward if you say it, but they're not clear about like what parts of production or what, you know, does that count this piece that was made here, you know, because of the complexity of the industry. So when I've talked to Mexican auto industry leaders, they're like, you know, they don't think that that means that producers are going to go running back to the United States, which is sort of the idea behind it of the Trump administration, because an auto plant is a major investment. But they also don't think that they can fully comply, and so they're just trying to figure out what it means, basically, at this point. The idea that it would, what's more important in that general sense is that all of those labor provisions are really going to depend on the Lopez Obrador government, which already has a commitment to raising wages and has already done it. With the wages were doubled in the northern border area. They went up 16% at the beginning of his administration, the first year, and then they just recently went up another 20%, the minimum wage, within the entire country. And so they have a commitment, although they've said that they're going to do this gradually. And it creates like problems because then you have entry-level people, if it's minimum wage, coming in at the same level as people with certain seniority, so there's strikes on the border because they want to move the whole pay, you know, schedule or whatever it's called. And there's certain complicated factors, but it will mostly depend on not just their political will, which they appear to have, but their technical and organizational and political capacity to bring those wages up. And the position of U.S. labor has been somewhat contradictory in the sense that they've long developed an understanding that Mexican workers are not their enemy. And yet there were times during this discussion where it kind of sounded like it, you know, where they kind of bordered on that they're taking our jobs away. You know, form of viewing the problem. So the best thing that can happen is that workers in the United States and unions in the United States will take a supportive attitude toward unions and the new right to collective bargaining in Mexico, and to cooperate with the government as long as they continue to show political will in enforcing these new laws and these new standards within the country. And then eventually, you know, those two workforces will be able to bargain against this one single source, which is the transnational corporation, from a position of greater strength. And then finally, yeah, I don't know also really about the specifics. I know that Pemex has suffered decreases in its investment ratings, and then kind of came back from that because of its financial situation and financial weaknesses. And I know that there's been uncertainty on the part of the investment community as well as other international oil companies. But in some ways, you know, according to the strategy of this government, they're just as happy to, they want to build their own capacity to do more of that exploration and exploitation, and are revising the energy reform that opened up to contract from the transnational corporations, and will also be reviewing many of those contracts to assure that they were not entered into with kickbacks and other forms of corruption of the previous governments.
So, hi. So this is a follow-up to what you said about the press, because frankly, I'm looking for some suggestions. I mean, I live here. For a while, I was watching the morning press conferences every morning, right? And I agree with you about not trusting the coverage out of, you know, the Times, Washington Post. I mean, I take it with a grain of salt. But then you're faced with what you described as a very polarized press here, and especially for someone who doesn't have all the context, even though I live here. I'm looking for suggestions for kind of how on a regular basis to make sense of, you know, what's happening, sort of the role we're playing today, which is, you know, periodically looking at what's said and the difference between, you know, what's said and the promises and how effective they're being. But if you can suggest particular media outlets, whether in English or Spanish, if that's gotten any better, because it's very confusing and hard to make sense of sometimes.
Yeah.
And I'm willing, you know, Spanish, English. I mean, I work very hard at trying to read in Spanish as well.
Yeah. I know. I mean, what do I read? I usually read, you know, I look at the New York Times, but I usually read the LA Times. I usually read La Jornada, but I'm often critical. Some of the online sources like Sin Embargo, you know, sometimes I look for specific people or something. But basically what you're doing there is you're going to find polarized and opinionated, and this is a tendency in the press everywhere now, reporting almost everywhere you look. And so you should try to have a kind of a good idea of where this is coming from and what interests are behind it first, and then balance them. And then also, but most importantly, and what's easiest about that is just say, okay, well, who's actually using information, you know, and who's spewing rhetoric? Because you could make an argument, if there isn't information, real information in it, you know, there's probably a reason why, and it's probably somewhat unreliable or just shoddy journalism. But it's tricky, and it gets trickier as more polarized, and a lot of the interests behind the media are ferocious and hidden.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. One is in the area of migration. I mean, we know the borders are very much sealed, and that the trickles that come are through traffickers and all that gun-related or criminal-related. But at the same time, the number of asylum seekers within the Mexican system is increasing. Is there a sign of hope in that regard? That's one. And the other question is, I look at many countries in Central America, Salvador, Honduras, that are very heavily permeated by criminal organizations, the government themselves. And I just wonder, where is Mexico in this light? Because there is increasing fear that this process of criminalization, permeation of criminal factors permeate certain parts of the government. We have seen it. And I just don't know whether it's receding or is increasing. I would like to hear your perspective. Thank you.
Well, on asylum seeking, there has been an increase in petitions for asylum within Mexico, as people are seeing increasingly, hostile and slim possibilities in the United States. But the system is overwhelmed. They have the same problems of not processing those cases, and they're really pressuring people to deport or self-deport instead. Even in Tijuana, where so many people have been returned across the border, Tijuana is a booming city, and those people are getting jobs, and the government is only sort of giving them work permits and making that possible in a legal way. The thing is that while Mexico, could and possibly would be willing to absorb a certain amount of this migration coming out of the Central American countries as asylum seekers, or as people who are granted asylum and refugee status, there are more factors than just a safe place that have to do with human rights when people migrate. What I'm saying is that a lot of these families are going to the United States not just because they can make more money, but also because, number one, they are safer. I mean, we talked to people in Tijuana who said, I left San Pedro Sula because of gang threats, and I'm still seeing, members of the same gang here. Or I'm being threatened in the same way here in Tijuana that I was there. But also because human beings have a right to be together as families. And we're talking about the majority of these people have family in the United States that are established, that are working, that are paying taxes. They could be sponsored by, even as they go through their asylum cases, they could be sponsored by their family members, be safe, and be legal in the United States, and then eventually, have a legal due process response to their asylum claim there. So there's a lot of factors that go into that. It's not just, deciding where to put people. People have a right to be where they're safe and where they're together and where their rights can be fulfilled and respected. In terms of the crime situation, in Honduras, which you mentioned, the brother of the president was just convicted for drug trafficking, and the president himself was listed as an accomplice. In fact, it was discovered during that trial, which took place in the United States, that they had used the profits from drug trafficking, that he actually put his initials on packages of cocaine, that they were so arrogant that what they considered their impunity for being, U.S.-supported rulers of a country, that those proceeds were used to fund the illegal campaign of the current president and to keep him in power. This was established in a court case in the United States, and the United States continues to support Juan Orlando Hernandez in Honduras against the will of the majority of the Honduran people as well. And then we wonder why people flee, and we criminalize them when they end up at our border, either border. The situation in Mexico, they talk about in Colombia and other countries capture of the state by organized crime. But really the situation in Mexico historically has been that organized crime and the state have a symbiotic relationship that grew up together. They are structurally intertwined, which makes it so difficult for the government now, or anyone who genuinely wants to try to disentwine, that's a word, that relationship, to actually do it. We're seeing the results of that as they just begin to go out the tip of the iceberg in corruption here. We're seeing 45 governors, ex-governors, not a city governor, who have been accused of crimes, many of them having to do with organized crime and money laundering. Some have been prosecuted, some have fled justice, and some have yet to be prosecuted. We're seeing ex-ministers like in the corruption, well, in the organized crime part of it, you know, they're beginning to, we see Garcia Luna. Genaro Garcia Luna was, first of all, was essentially the drug czar and the U.S. point person for the war on drugs in Mexico, and then the Secretary of Public Security, the Ministry of Public Security on the federal level. He was the head. And the United States had basically one person that they dealt with on the war on drugs, and that was Garcia Luna. Now he's being prosecuted in New York on charges of money laundering, drug trafficking, and making false statements. There's no way on earth, and I know we've studied deeply the DEA and everything, that the United States government did not know that Garcia Luna was receiving bribes from the Sinaloa cartel the entire time he was there, and from well before he was there. They knew. And that's why I remember one journalist, I said, well, he said, what do you think they call it? The Drug Enforcement Administration. Okay, the Sinaloa cartel this route, you know, and they're going to be able to pass this much cocaine into our market. Now we're going to like shut down the setas here. They're administrating.
Yeah.
And that's what they were doing. There was always rumors during the administration that the governments were favoring the Sinaloa cartel over the others because they felt, well, let's get, you know, these guys are pretty professional. You know, they don't do extra harm to the society unless they have to, basically. In which case they could be like tremendously brutal, as we all know. There are plenty of homicides and blood on El Chapo's hands. But then we can just deal with them, you know, and it's just simpler that way. And that was essentially what was going on for a long time. In fact, there's even kind of at least worthwhile listening to hypotheses that they captured El Chapo by accident. And it certainly did cause, it caused exactly the reaction that we've always said it would cause. Massive violence. If you look, that's where we see another major spike after the Sinaloa cartel, after El Chapo's taken out. And that wasn't because they didn't have new leadership, they do, and they continue. They just now announced yesterday that the cartel Nueva Generación Jalisco is now larger than the Sinaloa cartel. And it's brutal, and so you get to a point where you're analyzing these kinds of things, and you kind of sort of figure out what's happening in Ciudad Juarez, and Michoacan explodes. And, you know, so then we began to just say, oh, we have to look at this on a deeper level. What are the dynamics, and what are the public policies that instead of stopping it are actually feeding it? And that's when we got into, and it's the same with corruption. I mean, heads can start rolling, and it's still not going to get at it because it's all so structural at this point. And there's such powerful interest behind it. Until we actually are willing to recognize that and say it out loud, we're not going to be able to make much headway in the United States or in Mexico. On the Merida Initiative and the real problems that exist with organized crime, what we always say is, look, we're talking about a transnational industry where the market, all the money's made for them, I mean, pretty much. And consumption in Mexico is like 8% of the flow, or less, the last time I looked at a figure. You know, so all the money's being made in the United States. U.S. government, if you want to help Mexico with this problem, there's a whole range of programs and reforms in drug policy especially that need to take place in your country, and stop using that as a pretext for intervention in Mexico, because that's all it is. You know, but nobody listens so far anyway. I mean, we just got to keep saying it.
You said that Mexico was happy that the NAFTA, that I still call it NAFTA, agreement is settled pretty much and is going to be voted on. And yet, and it is in the Senate today, one of the 3 senators running for the Democratic nomination is going to be voting against it. He has announced Bernie Sanders. And it leads me thinking that there are a lot of people in this room who are going to be voting in Democratic Party primaries over the next 2 or 3 months. And they may want to hear if you have any thoughts in contrasting the 3 or 4 leading candidates as far as how they would be best for Mexico if they became, or he or she became, president of the United States.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I were Bernie Sanders and I was fairly confident that NAFTA was going to go through, I would vote against it too, because symbolically we can't say this is good agreement, like I said, you know, and it's important to be consistent and say, you know, the first NAFTA was bad, this one is really not that different, and so it's still bad in that sense. But I think that it has been absent from the policy debate on this and the back and forth between who claims credit for a slightly improved NAFTA between the Trump administration and the Democrats. It has been absent the effect that it's had on Mexico and the reduction of policy space for Mexico to have that hanging over its head. But as far as the Democratic candidates, first of all, it's very important for Mexico to defeat Trump. There's no doubt about that, and for any chance of the type of social justice reforms that the government is trying to carry out and that the grassroots movements are trying to carry out. And then secondly, you know, we haven't heard a lot. It's funny about Mexico, because if you were to do, I'm sure, if you were to do like monitor the press and say what foreign country has most been in the US press, it would be Mexico. Whether you're talking about immigration, whether you're talking about the border, but for some reason that has to do with historically being considered the backyard in part, you know, it rarely comes up as a foreign policy issue. If you said, what's the prominent foreign policy in the United States? Almost nobody would say Mexico. You know, the most integrated relationship, it's just like somehow it falls between the crack in the framework of US politics. It's not foreign policy, they don't think it is. It's not, you know. It's not immigration, it is, but it's not. But it's not immigration because the United States has always insisted that immigration is only a domestic issue. And so it falls through the cracks. And so we haven't heard a lot about it, although we have heard some about immigration. And in that sense, and again, I think I need to do a more up-to-date review of everything, but I do have, you know, direct experience of analyzing, not personally, with Joe Biden because of his role in the Obama administration. And Joe Biden was like the #1 drug warrior of the Obama administration in Latin America. When Otto Perez Molina came out, when the Organization of American States put out a major effort saying prohibitionist policies have failed, we are not willing to do the United States dirty work of militarizing the country against drug cartels because it's extremely costly to our countries. We want to change the paradigm on this. The Guatemalan president came out, and then the Organization of American States adopted a very strong document and position in that sense. The Obama administration immediately sent Joe Biden down to say, you can't do this. You know, the drug war's on. You know, they changed some of the domestic policies on prohibition and on incarceration. But it was the role he played in Mexico and Latin America was very clear. And also in terms of that NAFTA neoliberal model. So I'm very firmly convinced that Joe Biden would be have a negative effect on